Hello everyone, welcome. This is Middle East Now here on I-24 News, and first our headlines. The growing international pressure on Iran not to escalate the war in the Middle East. Sinwar, the mastermind of the October 7th massacre, is now the absolute ruler of Hamas. And what all of that means for over 100 Israeli hostages. The US, Europe, and maybe even Russia are scrambling to calm down the flames in the Middle East by putting increasing pressure on Iran not to escalate the war. Here's more in the next report.
1 week since the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, 1 week of Israel on edge, bracing for an impending Iranian attack. But despite a week of Iranian threats of revenge, some are beginning to think it won't be as bad as first feared. Following a diplomatic blitz from the US and its allies, the Washington Post, citing White House officials, says that Iran may have been deterred by heavy pressure and may limit its response to Israel.
Over the past few days, we've been in constant contact with partners in the region and well beyond. In those conversations, we've heard a clear consensus. No one should escalate this conflict. We've been engaged in intense diplomacy with allies and partners, communicating that message directly to Iran.
But despite a fear of escalation, Blinken reiterated the U.S. ironclad support for Israel. The U.S. has been coordinating a plan with Israel to defend the seemingly inevitable attack from Iran, with CENTCOM Chief Michael Kurilla meeting his Israeli counterpart Herzi Halevi and a brand new weaponry shipment to Israel.
I've ordered more cruisers and destroyers capable of ballistic missile defense to the region, and I've ordered the deployment of another fighter squadron to the Middle East to reinforce our defensive air support capabilities there.
And it's not just the U.S. Iran's ally Russia is trying to quell tensions, with Vladimir Putin reportedly telling Ayatollah Khamenei that he must try to avoid civilian casualties in the strike on Israel. Meanwhile, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, a group of 57 predominantly Muslim countries, is convening in Saudi Arabia to discuss the Iranian response to Israel. But as of yet, no rockets have been fired at Israel, something that Israel, its allies, and even some of Iran's allies hope will not change.
And here in the studio tonight, Shiri Fine-Grossman and Dan Perry. Thank you both for coming. Dan, let me start with you. We're in the round of guessworking here. What's going to happen? Who's going to do what?
I mean, Israel is in an extremely inelegant state of appearing passive, the watchful waiting, whatever you want to call it. But it's extremely reassuring that there is such a clear and public coalition that's been formed to defend against any possible attack. I think that serves more than one purpose, because it also underscores to the Israeli government not a dependence on the world, but how the problem is bigger than Israel itself. And there is a lot of value to such a strategic alliance. And indeed, looking a little bit further beyond the current moment, as we all know, what the U.S. is offering Israel is just that alliance formalized, enlarged, and arrayed against Iran, which has tremendous strategic value to Israel. And the fact that Netanyahu has projected indifference to the package deal that Biden has been shopping around is a little bit shocking, rather reckless. Let's hope indeed Iran is compelled to not react. I suspect that would have to be part of a package deal, and we saw the other side of that package in statements today from John Kirby suggesting that a deal to bring back the hostages, which is another way of saying a deal to end the war, is imminent, has never been closer, and all kinds of such diplo-speak.
We've heard this before.
It amounts to pressure on Israel. And we've seen all kinds of pressure on Israel to end the war in Gaza. So I think protecting Israel from Iran and Hezbollah and establishing a regional umbrella goes hand in hand with Israel being what Biden called a responsible partner to the United States.
Shiri, are you impressed by the international pressure on Iran right now?
Well, I'm impressed mostly from the presence of the U.S. From a military perspective. I think that's the main thing that deters Iran. Deters in a way Russia, because both of them don't want to see this American presence in the region, and this is actually was the strategy of Qasem Soleimani to get the U.S. forces out of the Middle East. What we're seeing is the opposite. So this is the latest events are against the Iranian strategy, and I think that's a major part of their incentive to calm things down. I don't think it's hard to see that they don't react at all, but it's very possible that they won't react in a way that forces Israel to counterstrike on, let's say, strategic sites in Iran.
Right. In this ongoing accountability or accounting of the Middle East, there's also Hezbollah, who's supposed to react as well. So that's not off the table at all.
Yeah, I think we should. The conversation is totally separate. I think Hezbollah will react and react differently and harshly. It has many ways. Obviously, we've all already understand there is a soft spot when we're talking about short range missiles, drones that they have. It's not. It doesn't have the same, time of response as drones coming from the Houthis, from Iraq, or from Iran. So this is an issue, and it's hard to see how Hezbollah doesn't react. But again, I think messages on both sides just show how much everybody wants to find the ladder to get down from the tree.
Right. Then even a war between Hezbollah and Israel, a full-blown war, even without Iran being involved directly, this is still a major war.
Yeah. There is this question of whether the other side, Hezbollah or Iran, want a major escalation. And I've heard all kinds of speculation that they don't, assessments that they don't. It may be based on intel. Some people claim it is based on intel. But really, these organizations are so so dependent on a few people at the top. Some of them, in some cases, are isolated, certainly from the world, but even from many of their people, that it strikes me as a rather great unknown. Hezbollah has, rockets that can target sites in Israel. Hezbollah has made it clear that they consider the IDF headquarters in Tel Aviv, right in the center of Tel Aviv, to be a legitimate military target. Well, you can argue any point you want, but if they try to do any such thing, I think it would be war. And with Hezbollah, we have something, as Shiri said, very different from Iran, but for many reasons, one of which is Hezbollah's very existence is completely and totally unacceptable. For Hezbollah to occupy a third or whatever of Lebanon and to have hijacked the country and to use it to attack another country is a complete breakdown of the global order. And I've been writing op-eds about how NATO should step in. It is unacceptable. Whereas Iran's Islamic Republic regime is a tremendous calamity for the region, especially for their own long-suffering people. But the world tolerates horrible regimes. Yeah. A situation such as you have in Lebanon, a total breakdown of sovereignty, is really intolerable. And I would like to see the world, NATO, the United Nations start to take it a little bit more seriously, because to leave it in the hands of Israel is an absurdity, and given the nature of Israel's current government, is reckless on all sides.
Must say, it's very well put. I don't know if they got the memo in NATO, but they didn't get it, when the Ukraine conflict started. So, there you go. Meanwhile, we are talking about a future war, but things are not even nearly quiet on the border between Israel and Lebanon. I-24 News' Zach Anders is there live with the latest. Zach.
Hi, good afternoon. We're in Nahariya, where life feels like it's going on somewhat normally. This is the site of yesterday, a fairly major attack with multiple casualties, one in serious, very severe condition still, per the latest knowledge that we have, although the update that I had late yesterday night was clinging to life. What we're seeing at this point in the afternoon, 4 attacks Hezbollah has claimed responsibility for. Within the last 15 minutes, there's been another round of alarms, and Safad, we're getting some images in of that town here about 8 miles from the Lebanese border, of interceptions taking place there in Safad, or above Safad. That's significant again because that's the site of IDF Northern Command. Now, of these 4 attacks, we don't have any reports of casualties. We're still waiting on a comprehensive damage assessment. What we do know is in southern Lebanon throughout the day, there have been multiple IDF, IAF airstrikes that have been taking place. The IAF says that they've targeted and killed another member of, or they're calling him a field commander of one of the anti-tank regiments within Hezbollah. We can't confirm his rank. I do believe that Hezbollah has actually just posted the image confirming his death. I just haven't gone and taken a look at it and had that translated yet. But the totality of this is Hezbollah's latest announcements have brought their own death count over 400 now. Some of the estimates, even my own notes, we believe that count is actually much higher. But this is just what Hezbollah has acknowledged, how many have died over the course of the last 10 months. So again, no casualties reported here in northern Israel at this point in the afternoon. 4 attacks Hezbollah has claimed responsibility for. Looks like the deepest is on Safad. That's just a few minutes ago. It's unclear how many interceptions took place. We're only seeing images of 1 right now, but potentially more. So we'll keep an eye on things. It's a lot quieter than it was yesterday, but of course that could change at any moment. And by this time yesterday, I mean, we had already seen 7 Hezbollah attacks and a critical incident with at least 7 serious casualties that were suffered from falling shrapnel and the damage by these attempted interceptions on the drones as they were flying smack overhead here in Nahariya.
Right. Zach Anders, thank you very much in northern Israel. Now let's bring in Behnam Ben Talblo from the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Good evening to you and welcome back to the show. We've been talking here about the fact that everybody is worried about an escalation, like everybody around the world. And the question to you is, will the Iranians succumb to pressure? What's your guess?
Great to be with you. It depends on what kind of pressure. Obviously, right now you have the Biden administration trying to push to de-escalate things in the region. The problem is that mission to de-escalate basically hurts the Biden administration's other mission in the region, which is to restore deterrence, or to bolster deterrence for Israel, bolster deterrence for America, make sure that forces are protected in the region. So this is a contradictory mission. And this basically pressures or actually eerily incentivizes the Islamic Republic to take more escalatory or more overt military action. So this is, in my view, a big problem. The second, of course, is that you've had much less of a diplomatic fury than before April 13 and 14. You've had a meeting with the head of Russia's NSC. You've had a Belarusian air defense official, I think, and you had the foreign minister of Jordan, most notably, all in Tehran over the past few days. But minus foreign minister Safadi, I think the rest of the forces there don't mind a little bit more Iranian kinetic action. And I think right now we have to be asking ourselves, is it a matter of when or if? And I certainly think it's a matter of when the regime will again go to use overt military tools against Israel.
Yeah, Behnam, stay with us. Dan, you want to react to that?
Look, I fully agree that deterrence is essential. But if Iran is, in effect, deterred by threats or by cajoling or by whatever means from carrying through a major escalation, the resulting in de-escalation, is that not deterrence? Because they've been deterred. I think that would be the way to resolve the contradiction. Am I wrong?
Yeah, I think Shiri's encouraged by the American reaction, right?
I am encouraged, but look, I mean, having said that, you know, I don't believe this de-escalation is because of diplomacy. I think it's because they brought in U.S. presence, and I think that should remain as a deterrence to further escalation. And this is something that we've seen this administration and previous administrations actually move away from, moving the U.S. out of the Middle East for various reasons. And in a way, it's part of why we are where we are.
I would add, if this is a model for future activity here, the diplomacy, warfare, you know, two sides of the same thing. If Iran was deterred by what in effect is a big stick, then I do believe that is the exact strategy that Ben is advocating. I think the contradiction is resolved by the nature of the deterrence. The U.S. moved a lot of heavy machinery in here and probably made some threats.
Right. Behnam,
I have a question, actually. It sounds like some folks are kind of prematurely taking a victory lap. I don't see the Iranians standing down. And across Iranian newspapers last week and this week, the word was bloodlust. It is responsible. It's wise for the U.S. to be moving the 4,000 plus troops to the region. It's wise to be adding more air and missile defenses. But I don't think the Iranians have stepped back. Am I incorrect?
No, it was conditional. We were saying if they do, then it will be a case of successful deterrence.
Yeah. And of course, we do not forget that the Iranians have been engineering the whole thing here for years. Yeah, they're not running away. But, you know, we've been talking for a long time, Behnam, about the United States abandoning the Middle East. They're not interested anymore. They're gone. But they're back. You got to give it, you know, you got to give them this at least.
So it really depends on how you define success here. For instance, the Defense Department might say, despite the peaks and troughs of the U.S. force presence changing over the past 10 to 15 years in the Middle East, one thing that they may look to as a constant is the desire to actually push for integrated air and missile defense. And that is one of the constants from the Obama administration, the Trump administration, the Biden administration. And that constant was on full display between April 13 and April 14, where the U.S. was able to put a coalition together, make it interoperable and integrated, as well as actually take advantage of the fact that the U.S. could still control or help others patrol the airspace between Iran and Israel, essentially downing every single drone that was fired from the regime. This time, however, if the regime does do a more multi-directional attack or directly go after U.S. forces, that raises the question as to, are these troops there sitting ducks? Because if we move more personnel, if we move more munitions, if we move more equipment, but our entire policy is based on deterrence by denial, meaning just intercept that which comes at you, and not deterrence by punishment, which is make sure the regime knows that they will risk losing something far greater or a far greater value than the cost of one projectile. We'll be going through multiple Aprils, multiple Augustes, and the fact that the Islamic Republic now is fighting a limited war overtly and kinetically against Israel, and Israel is somehow not able to respond or not able to claim it, means that the Middle East is getting more dangerous, not less, even though the U.S. keeps changing the size, quantity, lethality, and geography of its force posture in the CENTCOM AOR.
Yeah, Dan?
I mean, I fully agree. Israel's passivity vis-a-vis all its fronts, except for Gaza, is basically ridiculous and unfair to Israel. The world that demands that passivity, as I've said before, should become involved. That said, for Israel to ask for this global involvement requires Israel to be reasonable on the one front where it's active, and that's Gaza. I think everything here is connected, and Israel's weakness vis-a-vis Iran comes from what I believe to be its unwise policy in Gaza.
Right. Behnam, I want to ask you about Saudi Arabia. Apparently, the acting foreign minister of Iran is there today. Strange relations between the two, Saudi Arabia and Iran. What would the Saudis tell Iran right now, in your opinion?
It's possible that the Saudis have either their own or a variant of the existing message that the Jordanian foreign minister gave them, which is an organic call for de-escalation as they perceive it, but also potentially could be carrying an American message as well. It's too soon to tell. But unfortunately, in the Iran-Saudi relationship, the Iranians understand that they have the leverage here. They essentially have forced Saudi Arabia, a major U.S. security and diplomatic and intelligence and even economic partner in the region, into this position of hedging away from the U.S. architecture, despite all the good news of a potential Abraham Accords 2.0, and having to slowly embrace the Islamic Republic. You had Iranian defense officials at a Saudi defense fair in 2024. You've had the opening of the consulate in Mashhad, the opening of the embassy in Tehran. And you even had comments by Saudi officials about desiring to invest financially in the Islamic Republic, which is not a wise fiscal decision. But nonetheless, all of this stems from the fact that the Saudis are moving into a pay-to-play scenario to buy their security from the Iranians. And that should be setting off major alarm bells in Washington that our partner does not believe we have their back, and to have their own back, they're hedging towards our adversary. So this, again, this cascade of events should be setting off major alarm bells.
All right, Behnam, thank you very much for your perspective tonight.
Thank you.
Where are we at right now, Shiri? Everybody's confused. Who's more confused, the Iranians, the Israelis?
I don't think a lot have changed since last week. I mean, we have a few less people.
I'm sorry
in
for
the
these
world.
terrible questions, but that's where we are right now.
But it's you know, it's just a matter of where we are. This is a long war. It's going to be longer still, and like Dan said, once we resolve the Gaza issue, we're going to have to you know, challenge deal with the real challenge is Iran, and it's just, I think, from a strategic point of view, it just showed the world what it's
some
doing.
in Israel say, why not now? You know, if all the carriers are around and everything is around here. Well,
I think it's a true dilemma. I think it's a real dilemma, and the dilemma is actually not because of the situation in the Middle East, but it's the situation in the West, and how we can reform a cohesion, you know, a coherent coalition, which is hard to do right now. The U.S. is not very much coherent, and we're all very much divided, and some would say that's even because of what Russia is doing and China is doing with various social media and so on and so forth. So I think, you know, if I'm the prime minister, it's a dilemma, because you have Biden and you don't know what you have next.
All right, thank you. Meanwhile, it looks like the U.S. and coalition forces are stepping up their activity against the Houthis in Yemen and Iraq. Catherine Perez-Shakdam is with us now. Good evening to you.
Thank you.
There was a Houthi commander that was targeted in Iraq, plus a British strike inside Yemen, reportedly. Do you see a change there?
I see a change in the sense that I believe that at least London, hopefully Washington, is coming to grip with the realities of this war that we're fighting, that is not just against Israel, we have said it many times, but against the West in general. That is a real danger, that the world old route would become not just a target, but a mean to exert pressure against Western capitals. It's a reality, and I think that is clear in the way that the military has moved there. You see lots of naval movement in those waters. And I think that right now what the West is trying to do, particularly London, is to prevent the Houthis and other of the proxies of Iran to retaliate and, I would say, you know, up the temperature in the region, whether it's against Israel or against Western interests. And I think that the reason why they targeted, you know, Taiz, and before that, why Israel retaliated against the seaport of Hodeidah, is to try to dismantle, you know, the Houthis' ability to be launching attacks against Israel or, again, Western interests. And I think it's a clever move. It's not enough. You know, militias such as that, as the Houthis, only understand strength. And when you hit them once, you have to hit them again until they actually beg for mercy. And when you're there, you then decide when to stop, and it has to be on our own terms. This is something that we haven't come to grip with, which is the cultural differences that exist in the way that they formulate the military action and retaliation and campaign, more importantly. So I'm hoping that this is the start of, at least the beginning of an understanding that we need to play, not say by their rules, but understand that the cultural markup of how we address war in this area of the world is important if we want to win. And this is a big question that we need to be asking. Does the West want to win against the Islamic Republic of Iran and its militias? And I don't know if the answer is yes. The answer should be yes, but I haven't seen it yet, because the way that the UK has been distancing itself from Israel by preventing or at least halting arms sales to Israel, it is a question that, you know, for the life of me, I can't find an answer to, because why at all, and why now is the biggest question. So fantastic, they hit Yemen, they hit the Houthis, they somewhat, you know, render the ability to target Israel and other Western interests for now mute. It's null now. But what else are you doing to actually assist Israel in fighting this war? That is everyone's war. And if Israel loses, then everybody loses. So the question is, why aren't you throwing everything that you have behind Israel now to avoid suffering later? But, you know,
by the way, we are waiting to hear from the Houthis, who announce a special message tonight. I don't know what's going to be there. But the fact, to follow up on what you've said, that we are seeing a very increased American presence now in the area, and also some military action by the Americans and Brits, this is a change as well. Should we welcome that?
We should, but I think it's a little it's too little, too late, because again, everything. If you look at the language, because actions are one thing. I mean, they moved the military, yes, but what have they done technically on the ground to prevent further escalation? And talking to the Islamic Republic will not help. We've tried appeasement, we've tried to contain, and it hasn't worked. We tried the JCPOA, it hasn't worked. Every time that we show what they consider to be an act of weakness, which is to want to negotiate, to want to use diplomacy rather than the military option, has demonstrated to the Islamic Republic and its proxies that, I like to remind you, exist within the Arab world. In this part of the world, what they understand is not diplomacy, is the ability to exert force, and then diplomacy comes into play. We have done it in the other way. And they don't understand this other than a sign of weakness. This is the problem. Now, the issue that I have is that everyone is talking about appeasement and talking about a ceasefire in Gaza, or trying to de-escalate tension with Hezbollah, forgetting that those parties, those militia, are the one, accelerating, the end game, which is a military operation, a full military operation led by Israel, because it's an act of self-defense. We're talking about preemptive strike against the Islamic Republic. What is preemptive about an attack that already has happened on October 7th, that has been happening for decades now, because we have been, attacked again and again and again. People have died. Blood has been shed. What is preemptive about an attack that is, in my mind, an act of self-defense? So we need to change.
All right, Catherine, you made the point. We'll leave it at that because we have to go to a break. I thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And after the break, when we come back, the surprising development in Hamas leadership in Gaza. We'll be right back.
This broadcast is brought to you by Israel Bonds, the most direct and impactful way to support Israel. Invest now at israelbonds.com. This broadcast is brought to you by Israel Bonds, the most direct and impactful way to support Israel. Invest now at israelbonds.com.
Welcome back to Middle East Now here on I-24 News. In a surprising development, Yahya Sinwar will not only stay as the #1 terrorist in Gaza, but also will assume the diplomatic role of Ismail Haniyeh, who was assassinated in Tehran. Sinwar is the mastermind of October 7th massacre. He still holds over 100 hostages. I-24 News' Ariel Saran has more.
He is considered the mastermind of the most devastating terror attack in Israel's history. And despite not being seen in public since October 7th, he has just been promoted to the top official in Hamas.
إذا أعلنت حركة حماس أنها قررت بعد مشاورات ومداولات معمقة وموسعة في مؤسسات الحركة القيادية اختيار القائد يحيى السنوار رئيسا للمكتب السياسي للحركة خلفا للقائد الشهيد إسماعيل هنية.
Sinwar was elected to replace Haniyeh, who was killed last week in a mysterious explosion in Tehran, which Iran and Hamas blamed on Israel. In fact, Sinwar is the most powerful Hamas leader left standing, following the assassinations of its most top officials, including Haniyeh and his deputy, or the #1 and 2 of Hamas's military wing, all eliminated since October 7th.
Yahya Sinwar is an archi-terrorist responsible for one of the most horrible terror acts in history, the 7th of October. There is only one place for Yahya Sinwar. It's next to Muhammad Def, next to Randur, next to Ayman Nofel, next to all the terrorists that were responsible for the 7th of October.
Born in a refugee camp in the southern Gazan city of Khan Yunis, the 61-year-old rose the ranks in Hamas under the patronage of its founder, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. Sinwar helped establish Hamas's military wing and spent more than half of his adult life in Israeli prisons, where he learned fluent Hebrew. He rose to prominence following his release in the 2011 Gilad Shalit deal, with him as the top negotiator.
It's really an indescribable feeling. There is no doubt that this is a nationalistic event par excellence. It is one of the big strategic events in the history of our people's cause in the past years.
Since then, Sinwar gained a reputation as a ruthless enforcer among Palestinians. In 2017, he was elected as Hamas's leader in Gaza, maintaining close ties with Hamas military chief Mohammed Def and the Al-Qassam brigades. Together, the two dedicated much of their efforts to building up Hamas's military capabilities.
We will come to you, God willing, in a roaring flood. We will come to you with an endless number of rockets. We will come to you in a flood of soldiers without limit.
The selection of Sinwar also signaled a major shift in Hamas's historic patronage, abandoning the Muslim Brotherhood for its preferred backer, Iran.
We are building the resistance force in Gaza to reach what it has reached, first thanks to God, and then to Iran's financial, logistic, and technical support.
Since the October 7th attacks, Sinwar is believed to be hiding in the underground tunnels of Gaza, putting into question his ability to manage the group. Sinwar's appointment not only reinforces his radical path against Israel, but is also an attempt to show that the essence of Hamas remains in Gaza. As for Sinwar himself, he continues to be on the run, waiting for the moment he can emerge from the tunnels of Gaza, dead or alive, as the undisputed king of Hamas.
Here in the studio are Shiri Fine-Grossman and Dan Perry. Shiri, so Sinwar is the absolute ruler of Hamas. Now the question is, does he have any organization to rule?
Yes, he has a guerrilla organization and instead of a military organization. This is kind of where we are and where we have been in the last couple of months. And he's the one who wants to see Hamas going back to a military organization and leading it if the war ends in a way that Hamas is not totally defeated.
Dan, the bigger question is, what about the hostages then?
Well, they're clearly in the hands of Sinwar, essentially, at least most of them, I would hope all of them. Look, I think this development is strangely useful. It clarifies. Because in the past, when he spoke to Hamas, when he negotiated in some deniable way with Hamas, you didn't know who you were negotiating with, and whatever Haniyeh might agree to, you didn't know if Sinwar would also agree to it. Hamas was allowed to have these fake politicians with their veneer of dapperness and sophistication in their suits running around the Gulf. It confused. Right now, you have a very clear picture. You're talking about a terrorist group run by a terrorist. There's one guy, and I can only hope, and I assess that this is how it should be, that the war ends. If it ends, if you really have a deal to return the hostages in exchange for an end to the war, that somehow involves either Hania joining his friend, Sinwar joining Hania, his friend, where he currently resides, or taking up Hania's former residence in Doha, meaning Hamas should not be allowed, Sinwar should not be allowed to remain in Gaza. I have been saying for months it should end with exile, because if Sinwar, as the head of the Hamas, remains in exile, the war in the end will have achieved very little.
I just want to remind the viewers that Sinwar is a killer. He killed, he murdered 12 Palestinians. That's why he was in the first place in the Israeli jail, because he believed they were cooperating with Israel. Well, he said they were cooperating, and there's evidence that he knew that a lot of them weren't. They were just, you know, he didn't like them, so he just killed them. So this is a serial killer that is heading Hamas. And the world
not to mention what Hamas did to the Fatah in Gaza.
Exactly.
Yeah. On the question of hostages, Yair Moses is with us. He's the son of Gadi Moses, who was kidnapped to Gaza from near Oz exactly 10 months ago. Thank you very much, Yair, for joining us. Exactly 10 months ago. And your thoughts on this day?
Friend of mine said not long ago, we are out of words. We barely out of letters. So we don't have. It's very hard to talk now. It's getting harder every day. But we try to stay optimistic and to believe it's going to happen, and hope that our government will change their option and start to really try to release them.
I should mention that your mother was released. She was also kidnapped, and she was released during the first exchange. What do you know about the whereabouts of your father at this point?
We know nothing. We have only one video that was released by Islamic Jihad on December, but since then we have nothing. We know nothing. During his time in captivity, he turned 18. And we don't know if he's getting medicines, he's getting food, he has any proper condition. We don't know anything about it, nothing.
How old is he?
80. He turned 80 5 months ago.
Wow.
While in captivity.
Yeah. Were there serious opportunities to make a deal, in your opinion, that were missed?
Yes, I think yes. I know there are many options that, you know, I cannot tell for sure that Hamas would have agreed, but we know that from our government side, especially from Prime Minister Netanyahu, there were delays and things that he put to stop the negotiation or even delay it in some way that it's stopped. We had several times that we were a lot of hopes, a lot of talks about if it comes, and then we heard that he did something, add condition, talk to the negotiator, tell the delegation that they're not allowed to speak, just to hear, and more things that for sure delayed the negotiation. And we believe that we could have got to agreement much sooner.
Now that Sinwar is the one and only Hamas leader, do you have any idea what would be the effect of this on the negotiations? Do you have any guess, any hopes?
I really don't know. You know, Sinwar is unpredictable, and we cannot tell what he will do. But I just hope that he will. This is the man that we'll be talking to now. Hope that we'll be able to talk to him directly and then get to some agreement. I really hope so. I don't know, because that seems like he's hurrying to get to some deal. And from our side, it's also many times looked at we're not getting hurried and putting more and more condition that delays the agreements.
Yair Moses, I thank you very much. Obviously, we all wish that you'll be able to see your father soon with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Shiri, to the question of these negotiations, we've been hearing for months now that we were very close, then always something happens last minute. And now, are we, where do we stand?
Look, there's an opportunity with Sinwar. There's a risk and an opportunity because there have been reports here and there about if Hania was the one that is kind of delaying negotiations, or was it Sinwar's not being reluctant to make any concessions. So we're not sure what the truth is, but I mean, we could see this as an opportunity, right? Because he's been given now Gaza totally. He lost actually an election in Gaza in 2021. Some say that kind of was catalyzed of what happened on October 7th, not actually political reasons. And of course, the murderous ideology. So there could be an opportunity for him to say, look, he's looking around, there's no other leaders left. He's the one left standing. It depends how many concessions he's willing to make. So it can go either path, and it's for sure that everybody's kind of this waiting to see what's going to happen with the Iranian response before they're able to.
Yeah, there's always something. There's the Iranian response.
Yeah, no, but I think from John Kirby, I think Dan said it earlier, or you said it earlier, that we're trying to leverage this whole situation to get to a ceasefire, and this was kind of what Kirby was alluding to. So,
Dan, it's a very frustrating process so far, and there's no end in sight.
It's frustrating because Israel took too long to finish off Hamas. That's just the fact of the matter. 10 months is too long. 10 years would obviously be too long. 10 months is too long. And it appears as if Israel is under pressure, indeed domestic pressure, to agree to Hamas's fundamental condition when he weighed past all the complexities of this deal to end the war, withdraw from Gaza in exchange for the hostages. I suspect Sinwar will continue to demand that, and the pressure on Netanyahu is to accept that. And it's not easy. It's not so simple. In Israel, they talk about bringing the hostages home. It means ending the war with Hamas still standing. This is why I'm hoping that an exile deal for Sinwar will be part of the package.
Meanwhile, the latest from the fighting inside Gaza, I-24 News, Fabio Shapiro reports.
Even wars have rules, but some choose to ignore them. Since the start of the Gaza war, Hamas has broken many of the protocols agreed by the Rome Statute and the Geneva Convention, taking civilians as hostages, sexual violence, murder, and indiscriminate attacks on civilian areas are just some of the counts of international crimes which seem far to end. This Tuesday, Hamas shot an anti-tank rocket against IDF soldiers operating in eastern Rafah, adjacent to the humanitarian zone. The IDF announced a temporary closure of one of the routes from Kerem Shalom to the humanitarian zone, considering it to be an active combat zone, but stated that the crossing and other routes are, quote, operating as usual. It is not the first time Hamas disrupted the flow of aid to the humanitarian zone. The Kerem Shalom crossing was closed in May after a Hamas rocket hit the crossing area, killing 4 soldiers.
They've attacked Kerem Shalom, the crossing point where aid comes in along the corridor of aid, as you just mentioned. And here we're back in the propaganda element, that is that even if a corridor or a crossing point is closed for a few hours, the myth of this imminent starvation, and it's a myth because we've been told that there's imminent starvation within days away since December, and we're in August, and the starvation hasn't happened. So it's a myth. But any story that says, well, aid isn't getting in from this point turns into there's no aid going into Gaza, Israel's responsible for it, and Hamas gains points. And paradoxically, they fire at the crossing point. They don't care what happens to their people, and Israel gets blamed for something that's not even happening, which is that aid is being cut off to them, which it's not.
Article 51 of the Geneva Convention prohibits the use of civilians and civilian areas to shield military targets. The IDF released a map of the humanitarian zone pointing to 4 launching sites for rocket barrages within the humanitarian zone, some of them very close to UN aid warehouses.
Hamas will also operate out of humanitarian areas, out of schools and out of hospitals, and that gives them sort of an additional effect over and above just the defensive part, and that is knowing that the world press, world leaders very quickly fall into the narrative of Israel attacked a hospital, Israel attacked a school, Israel attacked the humanitarian area, and they neglect to mention Hamas military targets in the school, in the hospital, in the humanitarian area. So for Hamas, it's a win-win. If Israel doesn't attack because they're behind civilians, it's good. And if Israel does attack, to some extent for them, perversely, it's even better.
Later on Tuesday, the Israeli force targeted a weapons factory used by Hamas and the PIJ in the humanitarian area in Deir el-Balah. While the Israeli operations may also harm Palestinian civilian populations, the IDF claims that before each attack, many steps were taken to increase its precision and reduce the chance of harming civilians, while accusing Hamas and other terror groups of abusing humanitarian routes and aid designated for the civilian population.
And what about the day after that ever comes? Looks like nobody wants to get into Gaza, especially if there's no plan. Dr. Nasir Al-Omari is with us now. Good evening to you. Nasir, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan all rejected the idea of getting into Gaza. Why?
Well, it's a hot potato. In their view, it's intended to be a service to Israel. And I'm not sure that they are motivated that much to help Israel and have their soldiers face Hamas. They want to relieve civilians, but they want to do it in the context of a peace deal. But sending in soldiers would definitely be interpreted as helping Israel because Hamas is still there and they're still fighting. And bringing in an Arab force would be viewed by the public and by Hamas as a way to help Israel. I'm not sure if the Emiratis and Egyptians and Jordanians are eager to help Israel dig itself out of this problem.
You've mentioned Egypt. Egypt is right there behind the border, and no signs of any interest to do anything in Gaza to help the Gazans?
Well, when it comes to civilians, obviously what's happening right now is not helping civilians while there is fighting. I can't imagine anybody going in there and providing aid that is meaningful and sustainable. So they will continue to drop aid here and there. Hamas will probably continue to steal that aid. So this is not going anywhere. Helping civilians while the war is going on is not sustainable. And therefore, these Arab countries continue to watch. Their suggestion to Israel is that they embrace a peace process. I'm not sure if Iran wants a peace process or if Hamas wants one. And therefore, this will continue indefinitely unless there is some kind of creative solution to this problem that helps Israel achieve its goal of fighting Hamas while sparing Palestinians this misery that they're living in. I haven't seen any plan that makes that happen yet.
And so there is the PA, the Palestinian Authority, which both Israel and the U.S. Want to see actually a different one. What are the chances of the PA, getting better and getting in?
Well, they're in the same position with 10% approval rating among the Palestinians, and they're viewed as enemies of Hamas. They really don't have the political or any type of power to go in and take over. So I would put them in the same category as Jordan and other Arab countries. I think the thinking should, if there is serious thinking about this, relieving the civilians while maintaining this war, I think declaring Rafah as a security zone and bringing in a multinational force, not necessarily Arab force, I think that will solve the problem of civilians and their misery, and that leaves the political and military aspects. That's the only solution that I think can happen to relieve these civilians while everybody works to achieve their other goals, military or political.
Dr. Nasir Al-Omari, I thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Back to the studio here. The main problem, there's no plan, Dan.
Yeah, and if Hamas ends up in power, ultimately, it will be partly because Israel refused to discuss the day after plan. I do think the day after needs to involve, from a branding standpoint, the Palestinian Authority. Of course, it'll have to be different. The security aspect will probably have to be, at least for a while, partly handled by Israel assisting the PA, and also I do like the idea of a multinational force on the Egyptian border. But Israel has to start using public diplomacy. You can't contribute to this degree of mayhem and not tell the world what it is in aid of. And so far Netanyahu did that to preserve his coalition. This kind of nonsense simply has to end.
Sure.
To break this cycle that we've been in with Gaza and the Palestinians for so many years, we have to concentrate on other issues. Education, for instance, I think in both peoples, as we stand right now. And this ultimately what will end this cycle. And we have to stop just thinking about military force and start talking about the other things, the infrastructure that led us to. We saw civilians from Gaza, what they did in the kibbutzim, and that wouldn't be possible without very, very acute radicalization. So we have to, I think whenever we speak of this, we have to speak of this and not take it off the table as we used to. We have to do something that is different to break the cycle.
Thank you very much, both of you. Now let's move to Morocco. After an embarrassing tenure of the Israeli envoy to Morocco, marred by personal allegations, a new diplomat is appointed, and this time he is a Muslim. And that's interesting. Dr. Mohammed Shtato is with us now from Rabat. Good evening to you, Dr. Shtato.
How are you?
So do you see a sort of a new page here in this communication between Israel and Morocco?
Yes, definitely. It's a new page, a new chapter, and new relationship, because a Muslim, I'm sure, will do the job much better. And in history of Morocco, there was a time in the 16th and 17th and 18th century where most of the Moroccan diplomats were Moroccan Jews, and they were ambassadors sent to Europe, and they did the work perfectly well then. So I think this time it's the other way around. It's Israel sending a Muslim as a representative, as a diplomat to Morocco, and I can see that lots of things can be achieved this way, and probably it's the best way for the moment.
Yeah, that's an interesting point you've mentioned. We're talking about Mr. Hassan Kaiba. He has been a diplomat of Israel, and before that he had a 25-year career in the military. And those who oppose normalization with Israel in Morocco are speaking against him.
Well, it doesn't matter what they are saying against him. I think once he's in Morocco, in Rabat, he will be able to start a new career, a new chapter of the relationships by his own way, because he speaks Arabic, because he understands the Arab mind, and I'm sure he can be able to communicate better around the place and talk to the diplomats, but also talk to political parties, and even those who are against Israel right now might be able to listen to him and argue with him of what's going on right now. I think the choice is really very clever and very good.
We've just spoken about Arab countries that might want, or basically at this point are not so enthusiastic about getting into Gaza the day after. Is there any appetite in Morocco to get involved in some sort of solution, long-term solution for Gaza?
Well, Morocco is interested in trying to bring both Palestinians and Israelis to the negotiation table. They've done that in the past several times. You remember before Oslo I and Oslo II, Morocco was very active in that way. So again, Morocco is very interested at the political level, but also at a party political level to try to find a solution, to try to bring the two sides to talk. But I don't think in terms of kind of sending soldiers or something like that, I don't think that is possible for the moment because I think Hamas will refuse and the Palestinians in Gaza will refuse, and they will look at Morocco more like an enemy and an ally of Israel than somebody trying to help them out of the situation they are in now. So I think, let's say, negotiations, Morocco can play a major role in that.
Dr. Mohamed Shtato, I thank you very much in Morocco.
You're most welcome, sir.
Thank you. So this is it for Middle East Now. Stay tuned for the Rundown with Kalev Ben David. Good night from Tel Aviv.
والله ان في حادثه انا شباب عنوان سؤال مهم كم كلفك شغل نتيجه كذا شغل 6 شهور كذا.
Shalom, ¿qué me trae por aquí? La necesidad impostergable de 600 millones de hispanoparlantes que ahora necesitan escuchar el mensaje judío e israelí en tiempos difíciles. ¿Cómo lograrlo? Cuento con ustedes para continuar llevando a lo más alto del mundo mediático una inquebrantable diplomacia pública al servicio de la verdad sin concesión alguna.
The U.S. and Russia are urging restraint on Israel and Iran amid the Tehran's regime's threats to strike a heavy blow that could escalate into all-out war. We'll have the latest. Gaza strongman Yahya Sinwar assumes full leadership of Hamas. We'll chart his rise and look closer at what his ascension to the top of the terror heap may mean going forward. Far-left Congresswoman Cori Bush is ousted in a primary vote, and the squad member vows to come after pro-Israel lobby AIPAC for her defeat. We'll go to the U.S. for that and other political developments. For a week now, Israel has been nervously awaiting the harsh response promised by the Iranian regime in response to the targeted killing of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. The rhetoric of Iranian leaders has not toned down, but with the U.S. offering strong backing for Israel and Russia reportedly pressuring Iran to limit its strike in order not to escalate regional tensions, there are some wondering if maybe Tehran's bite in this case may turn out to be less worse than its bark. Well, more in this report from Yulia Pobogalova.
1 week since the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, 1 week of Israel on edge, bracing for an impending Iranian attack. But despite a week of Iranian threats of revenge, some are beginning to think it won't be as bad as first feared. Following a diplomatic blitz from the U.S. and its allies, the Washington Post, citing White House officials, says that Iran may have been deterred by heavy pressure and may limit its response to Israel.
Over the past few days, we've been in constant contact with partners in the region and well beyond. In those conversations, we've heard a clear consensus. No one should escalate this conflict. We've been engaged in intense diplomacy with allies and partners, communicating that message directly to Iran.
But despite a fear of escalation, Blinken reiterated the U.S. ironclad support for Israel. The U.S. has been coordinating a plan with Israel to defend the seemingly inevitable attack from Iran, with CENTCOM Chief Michael Kurilla meeting his Israeli counterpart Herzi Halevi and a brand new weaponry shipment to Israel.
I've ordered more cruisers and destroyers capable of ballistic missile defense to the region, and I've ordered the deployment of another fighter squadron to the Middle East to reinforce our defensive air support capabilities there.
And it's not just the U.S. Iran's ally Russia is trying to quell tensions, with Vladimir Putin reportedly telling Ayatollah Khamenei that he must try to avoid civilian casualties in the strike on Israel. Meanwhile, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, a group of 57 predominantly Muslim countries, is convening in Saudi Arabia to discuss the Iranian response to Israel. But as of yet, no rockets have been fired at Israel. Something that Israel, its allies, and even some of Iran's allies hope will not change.
And we have with us in studio Reserves IDF Brigadier General Israel Relik Shafir, former commander of the Tel-Nof Air Force Base and a former ace combat pilot for the Israel Air Force. We have our correspondent Nicole Tzedek and our Middle East correspondent Ariel Osran. And Ariel, trying to keep people calm after whipping them up into a panic for much of the past week. But we do expect, whatever kind of attack it is, Iran to take some move, Iran and its proxies. And maybe you should help us look at an indicator, maybe a key indicator of when that just might be.
Yeah, look, yesterday in a speech, Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah said that the psychological element of this attack is a key part of it. And by prolonging the response, they're amplifying that effect. And just the fact that we're talking about it for so many days, unfortunately, we're kind of playing to their hands. But as we've discussed this already, we also need to inform the public. So at the end of the day, what we're talking about is an expectation for at least aerial attack from Iran, Hezbollah in Lebanon, as well as the Houthis in Yemen. And we're looking for indications that cannot not necessarily foresee the future, but to understand the situation that we are currently at. So one of those gauges are the various flight tracking apps. Let's put on the screen Flight Radar. This is the current situation over the Middle East. You see Israel to the left, Iran to the right, And what we usually see is there's that line of yellow plains in western Iran. There's usually another line to that to the west of that, left of it, another line of plains over eastern Iraq. We've seen that line of plains consistently exist in previous days. Now it's not really there. Now, an indication to that could be an instruction that the Egyptian government has given its airlines based in Egypt to avoid flying over Iran tomorrow at 4:30 a.m. to 7:30 a.m. Tehran time. This is the current situation. Now, why are we even using this as an indicator? Because let's take a look at what the situation was on flight radar. This is on April 13th, an hour and a half before the first sirens were heard in Israel. A fairly empty airspace, but you still see a few yellow planes, mainly above western Iran and eastern Iraq. Now let's fast forward to 4 a.m. the day of the attack. You see a clear frame around the Middle East, whereas in the middle, western Iran, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Israel, absolutely nothing. And this is the image that, if we're looking for an indication, this is the image we want to avoid, or this really indicates that there is a looming attack coming from Iran. So let's go back to the current situation, what it is right now on Flight Tracker. You see it's not the same situation.
Right, especially that line of planes in the western Iran. So as long as you have planes in the area, don't expect an attack from Iran, for the simple reason that these are commercial flights. There's civilians up there, and any drone, missile, cruise missiles, and that's what we saw Iran use last strike in April 13th, those would hit these commercial jets. And so as long as these jets are in the air, it's a reasonable indication that in the immediate future, minutes or hours, shouldn't expect to see an attack. Again, this cannot foresee the future, but it will help you understand the present. Unless people are sitting all night watching that.
Please don't do that.
But please don't do that.
No one should.
But Relic, you who know the airspace above the Middle East maybe as much as anyone, certainly under combat conditions. What about this report, for example, from Egypt saying avoid Iranian airspace tomorrow morning? Possible indication of something coming?
We don't really know. Right. There's a lot of smoke and what we call chaff around, and distractions and disinformation that goes around, linking all the small pieces of intelligence and trying to foresee the future. In this particular case, the Iranians do not have to move their missile equipment, because they're already stationed ready to shoot. So the movement of the vehicles is not a sign, because it's already there. We don't know the type of attack that's going to be. Are there ballistic missiles from outer space? That's
maybe
one
provided
thing.
by Russia, the reports of Russia maybe sending arms, and they have these hypersonic missiles that they could provide. You doubt that?
No, that would not be the case. By the way, missiles that are shot through the atmosphere, out of the atmosphere, are hypersonic.
Right, okay.
And the Russians would, that would mean that the Russians are shooting those missiles.
Right. No, I didn't say the Russians are shooting, but providing
them. No, there's no indication to that.
Okay.
But the stress level makes us cling to any piece of information as something to show, because we want to feel sure that we can control the future. In this piece of the Middle East, for the last 3,500 years, it hasn't been easy to foretell the future, and neither it is now or in the next couple of years. I would think that the Iranians are thinking about what they're going to do, given that there's the Fifth Fleet is loitering around the Straits of Hormuz, close to their oil sending tankers, and so they would probably take a step back.
All right. Well, the Defense Minister Yoav Gallant was in northern Israel today observing an IDF combat drill, and he had this warning for Israel's enemies across the border.
As things stand, Nasrallah may drag Lebanon into paying the heaviest prices, extremely heavy. They don't imagine what may happen. I suppose if they saw a picture of Gaza, they'd understand. But logic doesn't always rule. Now it's impossible, in the state of Israel, to kill its citizens. Certainly not 12 children, and not pay a price. It doesn't work like that.
And Zach, preparations for the attack, especially there in the north, which is expecting to expect maybe perhaps the brunt of any kind of assault, particularly from Hezbollah.
Yeah, you know, we're in Nahariya, the scene of yesterday's drone attack that injured multiple people, and it's remarkable to know or to see how things just move. I mean, people are continuing to go about their lives, go about their days, and what can they do? That's the general feeling that you hear when you talk to people on the streets who are honestly thinking about anything but an impending attack. Obviously, the threat looms. It's there. We're very close to the border. People know that. The attacks at this point in the day, there's been 4 Hezbollah's claimed responsibility for. We're not getting any casualty reports. We're still waiting on a damage assessment. But of these attacks, we haven't, you know, if you take this calculation or this measurement that's been talked about, that whenever there's a serious airstrike in, as I mentioned, things are just going on like normal. People are living right now. If you take that calculation that has been spoken about, that if there's an airstrike in southern Lebanon that hits Hezbollah, kills a senior member, and then Hezbollah responds with a large rocket attack, somewhat like we saw when a Radwan commander was killed the night before, and then yesterday there was a large attack with the drones, and then later Kiryat Shmona saw some 30 rockets. Well, today the Israeli Air Force says they've killed another leading figure within Hezbollah's anti-tank unit, and we haven't seen a major attack since then. There has been a red alarm up over Safad, and we did see pictures online of what looks like one interception taking place over Safad. That's an important place because that's where IDF Northern Command is. But so far, again, if you take that measurement that Hezbollah gets hit hard and then they'll respond with a larger rocket attack, we haven't seen that at this point today. It's been somewhat subdued, and compared to yesterday when we saw 9 attacks and multiple casualties, today is much more quiet.
All right, if I may quote an old movie line, it's quiet, too quiet, some might say, especially there in Nahariya, where just yesterday a person was critically injured by a drone attack. Zach Anders in Nahariya, thank you for that. And Nicole, let's get back a bit to the report and going on in what Relic says. The U.S. doing everything it can to, is it even feasible wonders to stop this attack? I mean, we have, there was a meeting now going on of the Organization of Islamic States in Saudi Arabia, but the rhetoric we're hearing is laying the justification for some kind of Iranian response, saying Israel, which allegedly carried out the Khaniya killing, crossed the line. Some kind of response expected, but the question is how much the U.S. can not only dissuade Iran, but also dissuade Israel from striking back too hard to escalate the situation.
There are many diplomatic moves at play right now. As you mentioned, it's not only the United States that's working on their diplomatic maneuvering, but also Iran itself by calling that emergency meeting in Saudi Arabia today, hoping to possibly find some sort of a diplomatic legitimacy for if and when they do have this attack on Israel. But when it comes to the United States, their messaging remains clear, that they will be supporting Israel in defense, and that's why we are seeing a large show of defense with aircraft carriers, with fighter jets, with different surveillance aircrafts as well, all being sent to the Middle East region to help defend Israel. However, they say that is it. This is for deterrence and defense, and we want to make sure that the messaging remains clear for both Israel and Iran that they don't want to see this spark into a wider regional conflict. So while they say that we are backing you, Israel, they say still, when it comes to a possible counterattack or preemptive attack, when it comes to Iran and its proxies, they still don't want to see it go above this threshold. But the question of exactly how you continue with these tit-for-tat attacks from Iran, its proxies, and Israel, the U.S. and these Western allies are trying to find that line, but it still remains difficult.
And, of course, just one rocket gone astray, as we saw, for example, in Majd al-Shams, could definitely spark off something much bigger. All right, we're going to move from the possibility of a pending Iran-led attack back to the war against Hamas. Now, Yahya Sinwar has been leading Hamas in the Gaza Strip since 2017, and now he becomes the terror group's overall head, having been chosen to succeed Ismail Haniyeh after his assassination in Tehran last week. Our Middle East correspondent Ariel Osran takes a closer look at the 61-year-old Sinwar's slow but steady rise to the top of the terror heap, which was capped, of course, by his masterminding the October 7th massacre against Israel, and also what his selection by Hamas may mean moving forward.
He is considered the mastermind of the most devastating terror attack in Israel's history. And despite not being seen in public since October 7th, he has just been promoted to the top official in Hamas.
إذا أعلنت حركة حماس أنها قررت بعد مشاورات ومداولات معمقة وموسعة في مؤسسات الحركة القيادية اختيار القائد يحيى السنوار رئيسا للمكتب السياسي للحركة خلفا للقائد الشهيد إسماعيل هنية.
Sinwar was elected to replace Haniyeh, who was killed last week in a mysterious explosion in Tehran, which Iran and Hamas blamed on Israel. In fact, Sinwar is the most powerful Hamas leader left standing, following the assassinations of its most top officials, including Haniyeh and his deputy, or the number 1 and 2 of Hamas's military wing, all eliminated since October 7th.
Yahya Sinwar is an archi-terrorist responsible for one of the most horrible terror acts in history, the 7th of October. There is only one place for Yahya Sinwar. It's next to Muhammad Def, next to Randur, next to Ayman Nofel, next to all the terrorists that were responsible for the 7th of October.
Born in a refugee camp in the southern Gazan city of Khan Yunis, the 61-year-old rose the ranks in Hamas under the patronage of its founder, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. Sinwar helped establish Hamas's military wing and spent more than half of his adult life in Israeli prisons, where he learned fluent Hebrew. He rose to prominence following his release in the 2011 Gilad Shalit deal, with him as the top negotiator.
It's really an indescribable feeling. There is no doubt that this is a nationalistic event par excellence. It is one of the big strategic events in the history of our people's cause in the past years.
Since then, Sinwar gained a reputation as a ruthless enforcer among Palestinians. In 2017, he was elected as Hamas's leader in Gaza, maintaining close ties with Hamas military chief Mohammed Def and the Al-Qassam brigades. Together, the two dedicated much of their efforts to building up Hamas's military capabilities.
We will come to you, God willing, in a roaring flood. We will come to you with an endless number of rockets. We will come to you in a flood of soldiers without limit.
The selection of Sinwar also signaled a major shift in Hamas's historic patronage, abandoning the Muslim Brotherhood for its preferred backer, Iran.
We are building the resistance force in Gaza to reach what it has reached, first thanks to God, and then to Iran's financial, logistic, and technical support.
Since the October 7th attacks, Sinwar is believed to be hiding in the underground tunnels of Gaza, putting into question his ability to manage the group. Sinwar's appointment not only reinforces his radical path against Israel, but is also an attempt to show that the essence of Hamas remains in Gaza. As for Sinwar himself, he continues to be on the run, waiting for the moment he can emerge from the tunnels of Gaza, dead or alive, as the undisputed king of Hamas.
Relic, I guess one could argue, since October 7th, he really has been the head of Hamas anyway, because he's been driving it forward. But the question is if this changes any calculation in terms of the urgency for Israel to locate him and take him out as soon as possible as a means of demoralizing Hamas, not only within Gaza, but without.
I think we should assume, not having actual intelligence, that Sinwar has Israeli captives around him,
right,
in such a manner that any attempt to decapitate him one way or another would cost the lives of many Israeli hostages. So that is probably out of the question. I think this move allows the other Hamas leaders, wherever they are, in Qatar or other places, to have the weight off their shoulders in negotiations where they could say, you know, we're not the ones making decisions. It's Sinwar, it takes days, and actually allow them more latitude as far as they're concerned by saying we're not in a governing position.
Right.
So that is a change that actually helps Hamas.
Right.
Direct everything to Sinwar, and he's in a way untouchable at this time. So we should wait and see what the repercussions are.
I wonder if it takes some pressure off Qatar to eject the Hamas leadership now and saying, okay, well, the real leader anyway is in Gaza, and that could be some of the thinking that's involved there. Now, as the battle in Gaza rages on, Hamas finds itself increasingly cornered. The terror group's fighters are trying to exploit the IDF's creation of humanitarian safe zones as bases from which to launch strikes at both soldiers in the Strip and civilians in Israel. Fabio Shapiro and Manuel Honorat have more on how Hamas is again trying to exploit the Palestinian population in Gaza as human shields.
Even wars have rules, but some choose to ignore them. Since the start of the Gaza war, Hamas has broken many of the protocols agreed by the Rome Statute and the Geneva Convention. Taking civilians as hostages, sexual violence, murder, and indiscriminate attacks on civilian areas are just some of the counts of international crimes which seem far to end. This Tuesday, Hamas shot an anti-tank rocket against IDF soldiers operating in eastern Rafah, adjacent to the humanitarian zone. The IDF announced a temporary closure of one of the routes from Kerem Shalom to the humanitarian zone, considering it to be an active combat zone, but stated that the crossing and other routes are, quote, operating as usual. It is not the first time Hamas disrupted the flow of aid to the humanitarian zone. The Kerem Shalom crossing was closed in May after a Hamas rocket hit the crossing area, killing 4 soldiers.
They've attacked Kerem Shalom, the crossing point where aid comes in along the corridor of aid, as you just mentioned. And here we're back in the propaganda element, that is that even if a corridor or a crossing point is closed for a few hours, the myth of this imminent starvation, and it's a myth because we've been told that there's imminent starvation within days away since December, and we're in August, and the starvation hasn't happened. So it's a myth. But any story that says, well, aid isn't getting in from this point turns into there's no aid going into Gaza, Israel's responsible for it, and Hamas gains points. And paradoxically, they fire at the crossing point. They don't care what happens to their people, and Israel gets blamed for something that's not even happening, which is that aid is being cut off to them, which is not.
Article 51 of the Geneva Convention prohibits the use of civilians and civilian areas to shield military targets. The IDF released a map of the humanitarian zone pointing to 4 launching sites for rocket barrages within the humanitarian zone, some of them very close to UN aid warehouses.
Hamas will also operate out of humanitarian areas, out of schools and out of hospitals, and that gives them sort of an additional effect over and above just the defensive part, and that is knowing that the world press, world leaders very quickly fall into the narrative of Israel attacked a hospital, Israel attacked a school, Israel attacked a humanitarian area, and they neglect to mention Hamas military targets in the school, in the hospital, in the humanitarian area. So for Hamas, it's a win-win. If Israel doesn't attack because they're behind civilians, it's good. And if Israel does attack, to some extent for them, perversely, it's even better.
Later on Tuesday, the Israeli force targeted a weapons factory used by Hamas and the PIJ in the humanitarian area in Deir el-Balah. While the Israeli operations may also harm Palestinian civilian populations, the IDF claims that before each attack, many steps were taken to increase its precision and reduce the chance of harming civilians, while accusing Hamas and other terror groups of abusing humanitarian routes and aid designated for the civilian population.
Relic, this is a tactic that Hamas has used since the beginning of the war, but as its field of battle shrinks in Gaza, we see this really moving as maybe one of their prime tactics, because this is the only area they can really even operate in now, these so-called safe or humanitarian zones.
Let's look at it from the PR point of view. Have you seen any big protests running in the U.S., in schools somewhere in Britain or anything like that? No, because people have gotten tired of this tete-a-tete.
Right. Well, the school year is out, though.
True.
So that's one fact.
But you don't see them out in the streets, and this is may be because some of the truth about what is happening in Gaza, not that there aren't severe conditions for the Palestinians, but the number of people, uninvolved people who were killed during this conflict. If you compare this to any conflict that we saw, is minor, comparatively speaking. Same thing goes in southern Lebanon. So as truth comes out, and sometimes the truth does come out of the smoke and fire, they realize that there's no genocide, there's no mass killings, there's no hunger, and on that side at least, the way we're processing is working pretty well. They have less and less room for maneuver in Gaza. They will still have one because there's 2 million people that they can hide in, but there's less room, and the tension is shifted to Iran and Lebanon.
Right. And we should say U.S. politics, for example, as well, and other stories. And this is the inevitability of the news cycle when you are fighting a long war. We are going to go out for a break, but I'll ask Relik Shafir, Nicole Tzedek, Ariel Sharon to stay with us. We're going to carry on with the second half hour of the rundown. Lots more coming up on the program, so please stay with us. We'll be back in just a few minutes on the rundown on I-24 News.
This broadcast is brought to you by Israel Bonds, the most direct and impactful way to support Israel. Invest now at israelbonds.com. This broadcast is brought to you by Israel Bonds, the most direct and impactful way to support Israel. Invest now at Israel-Bonds.com.
Welcome back to the Rundown on I-24 News, and let's take a look at one of the most controversial issues ongoing in Israel right now. Did a group of Israeli soldiers rape a Palestinian detainee at the Israeli military facility Detainee? Were others abused there? And will Israel's Supreme Court close the controversial facility, which was established at the beginning of the war to temporarily hold suspected Hamas detainees? New security footage from the facility that may be of the alleged rape and a contentious hearing today in the Supreme Court are further fueling the debate over Detainee. Our senior correspondent Bianca Zanini has the story.
Protesters yelling shame and disrupting a hearing in the Israeli Supreme Court on Wednesday about the future of the controversial Detainee military facility, where Palestinian detainees have been held throughout the war in Gaza and where repeated allegations of soldiers abusing detainees have made headlines both in and outside Israel.
The matter is a matter of the laws of war. Even in times of war, it is strictly forbidden according to international law and according to Israeli law to abuse detainees. The laws of war are intended for exactly this, to prevent a situation in which enemy subjects who are in custody are harmed.
The detention facility was opened shortly after the war in Gaza began, meant to hold Hamas detainees until they could be transferred to prisons. According to the state prosecutor, the facility is of key importance.
This place must continue to operate. We are at war. It is a vital security interest of the state of Israel.
On Tuesday night, Israeli Channel 12 aired security footage from the facility showing a group of reserve soldiers picking out one detainee out of many lying on the ground, taking him to a corner, gathering around him, and covering themselves with shields from the camera. The reporter, Guy Peleg, says that shortly after the incident, the detainee is taken, bleeding, to hospital with injuries described as complex, and that the medical conclusion is unequivocal, injuries caused by the insertion of an object. Late last month, 9 Israeli soldiers were arrested for the alleged rape of a Palestinian detainee at Detainee, causing protests and riots from Israeli nationalists, with backing from Israeli National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, who all say that at a time of war, the country must gather around and protect the soldiers. At one point, up to 700 people were held at Detainee, but hundreds of Palestinian detainees have been transferred out of the facility in the last months.
Today, 28 prisoners are held in Detainee. The law's instructions and regulations established by the Minister of Defense determine a series of conditions that must be met in the detention facility. The question at the center of this meeting is whether these instructions are implemented now in the Detainee detention facility.
The Israeli military says it is investigating the case, which has caused uproar in Israeli society. Earlier this week, a report released by Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem says dozens of Palestinians held in Israeli prisons and detention centers since the war began describe incidents of violence, torture, starvation, and sexual abuse.
The jail was very, very tough, as you can see in my situation. It is an unfair detention, and there is killing, and they torture us with metal sticks. We were subject to all kinds of torture.
The report stated that the majority of the 55 prisoners interviewed for the report were released without an indictment.
And still with us in studio, Reserves IDF General, Brigadier General Relik Shafir, and our correspondents Nicole Tzedek and Ariel Osseron. Relik, on one hand, Israel is a democracy. It investigates its abuses. On the other, having this kind of internal discord in the midst of a battle, of a war, can be demoralizing. And of course, there's the external impact of this outside of Israel's borders.
Allow me to take you back. 1945, the Red Army is entering Germany. In a book by Anthony Beaver called 1945. 2 million women in Germany were raped by the Red Army. And he notes there were 200,000 Jewish soldiers within the Red Army, and none of them took part in the rapes. And that is because this is not part of our culture, and this is an absolutely no-no, even with Germans. And so this is something, it's an outcast activity that tarnishes.
Right. Everything here is alleged. Let's make clear. There's been no.
It tarnishes Israel, is against international law. And remember, we have hostages on the other side, and we may have prisoners of war in the future on the other side. Do we want to behave like Daesh? Certainly.
Or Hamas, we have to say.
On some of the Hamas, of course. And we have to say unequivocally, we abide by the law, not because we're a democracy, but because of our heritage and biblical heritage, where it is forbidden. And so I think there should be, in the public outcry against these kind of crimes, is just the fact that some people support them is tarnishing Israeli society.
Certainly, Nicole, we're seeing this. If anyone looks at social media, in any coverage of this, this gets more disproportionate, of course, to any of the crimes of Hamas that we've been talking about.
And so, as you mentioned, if Israel was good on their social media and good with their public advocacy, they could be painting this in a way that says, look, we are investigating this and doing the due justice, and we're still detaining these accused officers and having their day in court to see exactly what they did. However, that is not what is taking the media narrative right now. The two things that are taking the media narrative right now is the fact that, even though it's still being investigated, that these officers did this, and there is quite a lot of abuse in State Taman. And this abuse in State Taman, it's been the question of different media investigations for months, if not years now. It was back in May that CNN did a investigative piece on State Taman, interviewing some alleged whistleblowers about the abuse that they say that they entailed while in detention in State Taman. So that's one of the narratives we're seeing in social media. And then the other one is the fact that we're seeing these extreme right-wing protesters in outcry over this supposedly democratic call to action. And so the fact that then they're going in, breaking into some of these military bases as well, those are really the two media narratives that are taking, because the images that we're seeing coming out, they truly are wild, as you do see some of these extreme protesters break into these military bases all in protest over this legislative action.
Right. I mentioned it before. I served in the IDF during the first Intifada, when the Army, the IDF, had to suddenly absorb and detain thousands of Palestinians. It really wasn't prepared for that. It set it up Ansar, a base in the south. There were very similar narratives going on at the time, and this is a challenge for the IDF that is going to have to come to grips beyond just State Taman about what to do and how to handle just the massive amount of prisoners that they have to deal with in the Gaza operation.
And it raises the question, is correctional work, is running jails a task that needs to be put on the shoulders of the military?
Right. Young soldiers, like myself at the time, who had absolutely no proper training for that.
And you have an official body responsible for Israel's correctional facilities under the Ministry of National Security and far right-wing Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir. One would expect it should be under his authority, but given that his ministry has not taken adequate steps to manage this, it falls on the shoulders of the IDF when it, as you described, it is not adequately prepared for this task. And it also raises the issue of because there's a limited space, the IDF has been releasing many of these Palestinian detainees. One of them, I think the most prominent released, was the manager of the Shifa hospital, who was suspected to have had ties with Hamas. So it also raises that challenge. But at the end of the day, we're talking about a task that should not be put on the shoulders of soldiers. It is because of an absence of a proper properly functioning Ministry of National Security that is responsible for this. I would not be too surprised if the reason why the Ministry of National Security isn't taking responsibility for this is for political and ideological reasons. And in that vacuum, the army has to take up the task.
Well, clearly this is something the government will have to contend with, as well as the internal discord it's causing within Israel. Let's move now from Israel to the United States. Yesterday, U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris unveiled Minnesota Governor Tim Waltz as her VP running mate on the Democratic ticket for U.S. president. Waltz has a relatively low profile on the national stage, but Harris is hoping his Midwest background helps the Democrats secure votes in some key swing states. But who is Tim Waltz, and where does he stand on policies related to Israel and the Middle East? Joe Brown takes a closer look.
It may take two to tango, but Vice President Kamala Harris has found her Waltz partner.
Since the day that I announced my candidacy, I set out to find a partner who can help build this brighter future. A leader who will help unite our nation and move us forward. A patriot who believes, as I do, in the extraordinary promise of America. So, Pennsylvania, I'm here today because I found such a leader.
Minnesota Governor Tim Waltz was named as Kamala Harris's running mate in November's presidential election during a rally in Pennsylvania. A former teacher who served in the Army National Guard for 24 years, Waltz represented a Republican-leaning district in rural Minnesota in Congress for 12 years until 2019 and has been governor of Minnesota since then.
Minnesota's strength comes from our values, our commitment to working together, to seeing past our differences, to always being willing to lend a helping hand. Those are the same values I learned on the family farm and tried to instill in my students. I took it to Congress and to the state capitol, and now Vice President Harris and I are running to take those very values to the White House.
Waltz has held largely progressive views in his political career on issues such as taxation, workers' rights, abortion, and gun laws. His nomination was praised by Jewish and pro-Israel Democratic groups, as Waltz has often voted in favor of supplying military aid to Israel and was quick in his condemnation of the October 7th attacks. He has, however, praised anti-Israel protesters after 19% of voters in the Minnesota Democratic presidential primary opted for uncommitted to protest Joe Biden's support of Israel.
He's naturally not an anti-Israel person. And I think the issue will be Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket and her long record of her anti-Israel positions and being far more progressive. And the Jewish community in Minnesota is very attuned to this.
Waltz's appointment comes at the expense of Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, whose Jewish identity and comments supporting the IDF dominated talks around his nomination. Many Jewish Democrats feel that Shapiro was overlooked because of his religion, sentiments which were echoed by Waltz's Republican counterpart, J.D. Vance.
My view on it is it just highlights how radical Kamala Harris is. This is a person who listened to the Hamas wing of her own party and selecting a nominee.
But this didn't stop Shapiro speaking at the Harris-Waltz rally in his home state, endorsing the Democratic ticket and reaffirming where his priorities lie.
I lean on my family and I lean on my faith, which calls me to serve.
But with 90 days until the election, campaigning is in full swing, with presidential and vice presidential debates to be scheduled, something the new Democratic vice presidential nominee is relishing.
And I gotta tell you, I can't wait to debate the guy. That is, if he's willing to get off the couch and show up. So.
And there was more political news from the U.S. Yesterday. The so-called progressive squad of far-left Democratic representatives are down by one today, with the Missouri Congresswoman Cori Bush beaten in a primary vote by St. Louis prosecutor Wesley Bell, who is seen as more centrist and less critical of Israel. Many are crediting the pro-Israel lobby AIPAC as a deciding factor after it contributed $8.5 million towards her defeat. AIPAC itself celebrated by tweeting being pro-Israel is good policy and good politics, and noting Bush is the second squad member this year, along with New York's Jamal Bowman, to lose their seat in a primary vote after, quote, massive spending by pro-Israel groups. Here's what Bell and Bush had to say themselves after the results came in.
This district is ready for better and more accountable representation in Washington, D.C. Progressives should actually make progress. And that's what I've done my entire career.
Because see, now I don't have to worry about some strings that I have attached to it as much as I love my job. But all they did was radicalize me, and so now they need to be afraid. See, now they about to see this other Corey, this other side, because let me say this. I just grew up a whole lot more over the last few weeks. Just grew up a whole different way.
And I should add, Cori Bush went on to say she's coming after the, quote, the kingdom of AIPAC. Well, joining us now for more from Washington, D.C. is Josh Block. He's a former Clinton administration official, a fellow at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C., and a former spokesperson for AIPAC. And Josh, thanks for joining us. We'll get to Tim Waltz in a minute. I want to talk about this election with the primary, Cori Bush's defeat, which is quite significant, above and beyond itself. As I said, some people are credit. There's interest in both AIPAC and its supporters to give AIPAC credit for this to some degree, and also in Cori Bush to now put all the blame on AIPAC. But the fact is, there are some squad members who are more secure in their seats because the districts, their districts favor them. Figures like Rashida Tlaib, for example, Ilhan Omar, and others like Bush and Jamal Bowman. It's because their districts made them weaker candidates anyway on any number of issues. What's your take on this? How much is it AIPAC or even just the Israel issues that were responsible, for example, for her defeat?
Well, Caleb, great to see you. And, who am I to dispel the myth of the power of AIPAC? I mean, gee. On the other hand, let's be realistic here. AIPAC didn't cast a single vote in these elections. The voters in these districts decided to fire Cori Bush, to fire Jamal Bowman, not necessarily because they were anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic extremists who had policies out of step with the majority of Americans around Israel and other issues. They certainly were. But they did so because they didn't fit the districts, because they didn't represent their constituents well, because they were obsessed with their niche issues in detriment to the interests of their everyday constituents. And that's why you lose your congressional primary, not because of AIPAC or anyone else, because you failed your voters. Right.
Now, of course, there are many powerful lobbies in Washington, the NRA, the teachers union, we could go on and on. But of course, we know AIPAC draws a particular kind of fire. How much danger is there in the perception now that in recent years it's established a political action committee that contributes to candidates, that it's going to fuel this kind of rhetoric and make itself a sort of target in U.S. politics?
I don't think that's the case, Caleb. I think what's interesting about what AIPAC has done with its PAC is that it ultimately is creating greater space for moderates to win elections. Because, in many cases, the candidates who are running in their own primaries seek support from their bases. Those base organizations generally tend to be to the more extreme ends of their own parties, whether it's to the right and having to affirm, election fraud, or to the left and having to kowtow to the Democratic Socialists or to the Justice Democrats. In the end, what we're seeing here is that there is a space for candidates who want to be closer to the middle, more moderate, work across party lines, represent mainstream opinion, to be able to find the kind of electoral support that they need to run credible, effective campaigns. So actually, I think the political system is both should be grateful, frankly, to groups like AIPAC, which are supporting mainstream moderate candidates in these districts, and in the end, it will actually serve quite well, because the problem that has been plaguing Congress and driving these districts to the extremes has been this reliance on fringe elements to support their campaigns. And so without that need, I think we're seeing more moderate candidates win these elections. That was true, by the way, this last cycle in Indiana, where we saw a former congressman come back. He's a moderate and beat an extreme right-wing candidate. And we're seeing it in these districts as well.
Right. Now, let's talk about Tim Waltz, who is he is something of, in terms of Israel issues, falls more into the mainstream Democratic policy sphere. But there's no question that I think certainly supporters of Israel, many American Jews, were left with a bad taste in their mouth over the campaign against Josh Shapiro and how that turned out. And, of course, Kamala Harris remains a question mark for some of those supporters of Israel in the middle, I would say. So how much do you think that whole chapter may impact on, for example, the Jewish vote going into the general presidential election?
Well, I would say first, in the biggest scheme of things, it was a mysterious choice in a way, because Tim Walz does not provide Kamala Harris the kind of political breadth that picking Josh Shapiro would have. He would have helped her in a swing state. He would have helped her with moderate voters and peeled off support from the moderates or independents who are leaning towards Trump. He is actually from a safe Democratic state and appeals to the far left, the radical left, even if you will, of the Democratic Party, who were the most outspoken supporters of his choice and, of course, against Josh Shapiro on the basis of Josh Shapiro's religion. Now, they claimed they were against Josh Shapiro because he had spoken out against campus protesters or because he had spoken in favor of Israel. But in fact, of course, as you may have alluded, Josh Shapiro was more directly critical of this current Israeli government than Governor Walz or Congressman Walz ever was. And so it is a bit of a mysterious thing. All of the choices that candidate Harris was choosing from were not only mainstream pro-Israel. I will say there is some concern both in the atmosphere of the Democratic Party these days. I share those concerns. I saw Van Jones, a longtime Democratic commentator who was part of the Obama world, speak about the marbling into the Democratic Party of anti-Jewish bigotry and anti-Semitism, that playing a role in her making this choice. So I do think that there are some long-term trends that are worrisome for Jews that point against the viability in the eyes of this extreme left for Jews to play a leading role in American public electoral life. And that should concern all of us. On the other hand, I don't think this is it's not doomed for Jews. Most Americans and certainly most Democrats as well as Republicans are mainstream in their views. But it's a worrisome trend to see the campaign that was launched against Josh Shapiro on the basis of his faith.
All right. But again, we saw with the defeat of Cori Bush that some extreme figures also will suffer politically as a result of that. Josh Block, thank you for joining us on The Rundown. And I want to thank Relic Shafir, Nicole Tzedek, Ariel Osran for also being with us on this edition of the program. We are going to close out with some good news, a mix of news, I guess you could say, because the Paris Olympics have turned out to be games of controversy and extremes. And that has certainly turned out to be the case for the Israeli athletes and for some of the Jewish competitors as well. The Israel team has scored a record number of medals, but they and some Jewish athletes as well have had to deal with protests and threats. And yesterday in Paris, a ceremony marked another Olympics, the 1972 Munich Games, when similar incitement against Israel resulted in tragic violence. Jody Notelowitz has the story.
The 2024 Paris Olympics have proved to be a successful one for Team Israel, with 6 medals so far. But this comes on the back of heightened tensions surrounding the war in Gaza, with some calling for Israel to be excluded from this year's Games, even inciting fears that there could be a repeat of the 1972 Munich Olympics attack, in which 11 Israeli team members were murdered by a Palestinian terrorist group.
This was an attack on our fellow Olympians. It was an attack on the culture of peace that the Olympic Games promote. It was an attack on our Olympic values. This is why the 5th of September 1972 is the darkest day in Olympic history.
The Paris Games have aimed to be different, with Israeli competitors given 24-hour protection. Although Jewish athletes competing for other nations also had worries, citing increases in anti-Semitism. Given the underlying atmosphere, Israeli medalists were quick to dedicate their victories to their countrymen back home.
I think, especially in these times, it's meant a lot for the whole country. I think it made a lot of people feel very emotional and very happy. And like right now in Israel, everyone's terrified and scared. And I think it was a bit of light in these dark times.
The Israelis weren't the only ones affected. Gold medal wrestler Amit Elor became more careful with posting anything related to her Jewish Israeli heritage ahead of the Games, but said, quote,
The enormous pain, suffering, and loss of October 7th is unbearable. If my wrestling at the Olympics can bring even just a little joy in Israel, it will make all the hard work and sacrifices worth it, and extra special. I am an American proudly wrestling for the U.S., but in my heart, I am also wrestling for Israel.
Speaking at the memorial ceremony for the Munich Olympic victims, Yael Arad, the president of the Israeli National Olympic Committee, explained that they prepared their athletes for anything.
It's not easy to be an Israeli athlete in the international arena these days, but it's our duty, it's our privilege. We are doing it. We bring the Israeli spirit. We bring our love to mankind. We bring the resilience of the Israeli people.
Well, again, I want to congratulate all those Israeli medal winners and the competitors, and we'll have to see how the rest of the games go. And, of course, Amit Ilor, that Israeli young wrestler, proud child of Israeli-American parents, on her really remarkable gold medal victory. She herself has quite a story. That ends the rundown for today. Thank you for joining us. Of course, you can still follow us on our website and all our various social media sites. We'll be back tomorrow with a whole new program. So if you can, catch the rundown.